Today I'm going to be talking about Sparklines, which I introduced into 1.6.0 of Semiotic. And hopefully we'll be able to, adjusting things. Hopefully I'll be able to explain to you how to use them. They're a new feature. People got pretty excited about them when I showed them off on Twitter. And more than that, people got really excited about them. At Netflix, some of the people who I work with where we're using Semiotic, and we've already implemented Sparklines in our production apps at Netflix, which is exciting because they've only been around for a short amount of time. For those of you who aren't familiar, Semiotic 1.6.1, which is the latest version, has a new set of frames in it. Called the Spark Ordinal Frame, Spark XY Frame, and Spark Network Frame. And what they do is they create the same data visualization that you normally get, except they are scaled and formatted so that they can be inserted into text. So if you take a look at this example, which I'll drop in the chat, you can see on the interactive examples page the different kinds of charts you can drop into your text, and these are still fully interactive if you enable hover annotation or you put annotations on them, so they operate in all the same sort of principles that your regular semiotic frames do. You can create little network charts. You can not just create line charts, you can create anything an XY frame normally does. So you could do stacked area charts or difference charts, things like that. And also the things that OR frames do, so bar charts and stacked bar charts, and then more complex summary visualizations. There are still some little kinks, or at least there's one little kink, I should say. Everything seems to work just fine with it, except for some reason the Sankey diagram really does need to have more space to be drawn. I'm really not sure why that is. There might be some kind of internal default in the Sankey diagram. That's why this one down here, that's why I changed the line height. Which brings me to the last point before I start getting into the code. Sparklines in Semiotic use the line height, the computed line height of the text that they're in to get their height. And if you don't set any size at all, then they'll get the computed line height as their width as well. So you could tell it that I want a width of, say, 100 pixels. I think this is about 100 pixels. Or you could not tell it any width at all, and it'll give it a width, for, like it does for these network charts, equal to the line height. And the only other thing that it's doing technically under the hood is that anywhere where the HTML elements were divs, they're turned into spans, because you can't put divs into paragraphs. And otherwise, there's more bits and pieces that the documentation explains that I'm not going to get into right now. But I can jump into it if people have specific questions. Otherwise, I'll address it as it comes up. Let me go find, let's see, the wiki. I'll go to the wiki and point out some of these particular API entries on the Spark frames that explain some of these details. So if you go to the wiki on GitHub, that's where I've been trying to document the API. And you can see that all of these new frames have very short documentation because fundamentally they're the same as the other frames in Semiotic. In fact, they're less complicated than the responsive frames, which have an event that resizes them. These frames don't have a resize event, so the assumption is that you're not dynamically changing line height. And if that becomes the case, then maybe we can revisit that. But I think that's a reasonable assumption for Sparklines, and that allows them to be optimized without making them overly sort of technically complex. So this is what it looks like with some fully formed examples. Let's start to build some of our own. I have this code pen over here that I will share. Pretty standard code pen. In the settings, I'm importing the unpackaged version of Semiotic over here without any kind of specification for the version number, so it's getting the latest. I'm also pulling in this data file. This is that same Premier League data that I was working on when I was making the line charts. So maybe if somebody has another data source that they want me to play with, or if some use cases come up, but that's got a lot of data in it. And I think we can sort of dig into that to make lines and to make bar charts that we might want to represent in the text. So otherwise, this code pen, this pen doesn't have much in it. It's got some text, and that text is your classic lorem ipsum text. You'll notice that I've got a specified font size and line height. We'll get back to that. I don't think actually it has to be inline. So let me go in over. We'll take a look at that. In fact, I'll test that out on the fly. I noticed, the reason why I'm specifying it over here is I noticed that there's something about the way it seems like that CodePen creates the actual content down here that I think doesn't do the typical computed line height like it should. And so you have to specify the line height. It doesn't seem like it's computing the line height like it's supposed to, like any sort of normal DOM page would. But anyway, we can get into that, or I can explain that in more detail. I'll look into it on my own also later on, so you don't have to worry yourself too much. Let's get started by making a bar chart, simple bar chart. Ordinal frame. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds about how these charts are made, but I want to do the ordinal frame in kind of a different way than I normally do. Because normally what you would see is I would go in here and say, in fact, let's take a look at this data real quick, see what kind of data we're working with so we can find some nice bars in our data. So Premier Lines is an array of 69 data points, which is all of these football teams, and then the football teams show all of their wins, losses, and so on during some period. So let's go get the Queen's Park Rangers. Const Queen's Park Rangers data. I just want to get some data. Equals, and we'll go back. Oops. We'll go back to that. Array. This looks like array position 45. So Premier Lines 45. And let's make sure it is console.log QPR data. Let's see what it says. Right, so here we go. We've got the Queen's Park Rangers, and I'm going to make a bar chart. So why don't we make a bar chart out of the their performance between 1983 and 1995. So bar data equals QPR data dot coordinates filter. And what does it look like? Year. D.year, yar, is greater than 1983. And it's greater than or equal to. And then less than or equal to 1995. Let's see what that looks like. All right, so we've got 13 data points, 1983 to 1995, and that seems like a good place to start. At least will give us a bar chart. And we can show a bar chart of their points. So normally what I would do, normally what I've done in my examples that you would have seen, so I would say something like this. I'd say ordinal frame, and I'd be setting up in JSX, and I'd pass the attributes like that. So I'd say give it some data, give it a type, equals bar, and there we go. We've got a bar chart, right? And I want to give it an O accessor that equals year, because I want a bar for each year. And then I want an R accessor equals points. and so on and so forth. And eventually I'd build a bar chart, right? And so now we're looking at down here, this is a bar chart. It's above our text. We could make the size smaller, but before I get too far, I actually want to do this a different way. So usually in production, the way that we define frame properties is like this, bar frame properties. We don't do it inline like that. We do it inline when we're developing it, sort of for production. It makes more sense to turn it into an object and then spread that object into the properties of the component. So there we go. We've got this object, got ordinal frame, and we say ... bar frame properties. And that just does the same thing. But now we can go in here and we can do stuff like, say, O padding equals 5. And we can adjust all these settings in here. Style, fill, tan. I thought there was a tan color. Is there not a tan color? Pretty sure there is. Right, except it has to be defined as an object and not as a JSX attribute. There we go. Axis, we do want an axis. We'll put it on the right, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And we probably want the size, make the size a little bit smaller of my axis. I've got an object and an object because I continue to write this like it's JSX. There we go. Try it again. Give it a size, make it a little smaller. And this is all pretty standard stuff. This is not, as you might say, teaching you how to make sparklines. That's teaching you how to make a bar chart. Thing is, with Semiotic, and what I like about it, is that sparklines are basically the same thing. So if I just sit here and say spark ordinal frame, and I do literally the same thing. I spread those exact same properties somewhere in here inside this text. And what does it do? It produces a little bar chart. You can see it down here. And this little bar chart has some properties that are a bit different, and that's what's kind of interesting about the frames. So its height, it did not honor the height property that I passed, right? It does not have a 300 pixel height. It does have a 300 pixel width, and maybe I don't want it to be that size. Maybe I want it to be instead, say, 100 pixels. I can pass it a height, just if you feel comfortable or not, but you might not want to. You can actually just pass it the first value in the array for size. But I'm going to keep passing it a height just out of cleanliness. I'll probably come up with a better way to deal with that, or honor it as a single number, and if a single number, then it's the width. But it still expects an array for now. The point is, here's my here's my bar chart down here in the text. There's my Spark bars. You'll notice that it's got a lot of gap between the bars, unlike over here, and that's because it's still honoring that O padding. So what we can do is we can start to send different qualities to one of these frames, and we could do it this way. This is a convenient way. There's other ways we could do it. We could have another object and we could spread the objects separately. And then down here, I might say, well, I only want an O padding for my Spark frame of 1. And then it looks a little bit better, but then we've got the exact same chart inside. And that exact same chart can be annotated and have most of the interactivity that we have in a normal chart. So for instance, if we let's make an actual Spark line. Let's get a line out of here. This is actually, technically this is line data, so we could do that too. So why don't we just do that? Make it easy. Const line frame properties any bar chart where you're showing bars for each year is really a line chart made with bars. So we can just do that. Lines, remember line charts, XY frames take a lines property. It's an array, so even though our array only has a single object, it's going to be an array. Label is, what is it, Queens Park Rangers. Coordinates, is that QPR data? So that's the lines property, the X accessor is again year. The Y accessor, similar to the R accessor for the ordinal frame, is points. And then we'll want to style that line. So line style will be an object, stroke equals, say, dark green. I don't know what the color of the Queens Park Rangers is. And every time I have these things, nobody in the chat tells me anything about the Premier League. So I always thought I'd manage to finally find out about this stuff that I'm doing this on. And it doesn't happen. Axes, an array, orient right, orient, oops, what am I doing? Orient bottom. Just a reminder, axes, each axis object in the axes property in XY frame is going to spawn its own axis, and there's lots of settings from D3 axis, but really you don't need any of them. It'll even default the orient setting if you sent an empty object. But at the very least, I like to put orient keys in them. And then we've got all that, and if I'm going to wrap my ordinal frame in a div so I can float it. Style equals display inline block. And width equal to 300px and height equal to 300px, because that's the settings of the width and the height of the frame. And then I can put another frame after it, except this time I don't want an ordinal frame. I want an XY frame. XY frame. And then instead of the bar frame properties, I want the line frame properties. And I really don't need O padding, because there's no such thing. And now I have to go see what I did wrong. Line frame properties. First of all, I do want the size to be 300 by 300, but that's not what's keeping it from drawing. Let's see, we've got lines data, an X accessor, a Y accessor, line style, axes, and it's not drawing. XY frame properties inside a div. Let's go see what the error is. Line data accessor dot map is not a function, so whatever data I created wasn't right. Lines, coordinates, QPR data. Oh, wait, I sent QPR data instead of bar data. It's actually bar data as the coordinates that I used to make that bar chart. There we go, much better. So again, there's my XY frame. It's that easy. It's that easy to make a line chart in Semiotic. Super easy. That's great. It's equally easy to put that sparkline somewhere in my text. Just change it from an XY frame to a spark XY frame. And there it is already down there. Ta-da! And we'll change the size. Remember, we're spreading these properties, so I'd have to put any other property that's going to overwrite that after the spread properties. And we'll make it 100 pixels. Actually, we'll make this one, 100 pixels looks good. And so now you can see it. And you'll notice that it has the axes. So this is one of the things I wanted to point out. It has these axes, which is great. By default, if you send axes to a Spark frame, it's not going to render the ticks. Now you can override that. You can specify the properties in your axes, right? if I sat here and said a specific tick format, even if that tick format was just return whatever the tick would have been, then you'll notice that, and oh, I'm sorry, the other thing it'll do is it'll override the margin. So I've got to also send a specific margin, which will be tough because if I send it too much of a margin, we just won't see it. But if I send a bottom margin, 10 of 10, that should be enough. Where's my margin? Where is my margin? It's obviously saying something's gone wrong. Right, I keep doing this with JSX. There we go. And I can increase that a bit because my line height's high enough. And you'll notice that, it's starting to show this stuff here, and you can also see it down here. And you'll see that it's inheriting the font size, the ticks and everything like that. So you could, if you wanted to, go in here and format these ticks and really, like if you felt like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, let's say, so most of the time, you don't want to send, a margin, and you don't want to send axes to a sparkline. But let's say there's a time when you really do, when the important thing that you wanted to say about this data, let's go look at the data real quick. Say the important thing you wanted to say about this data was something like, maybe the story was Queen's Park Rangers dropped below 50 wins, dropped below 45 wins for the first time in 13 years, right? Which is literally what this data set says. Well, you could have the axis say tick values. The axis could just literally say 45 wins, right? Like, there's my 45 wins. You could do this with annotations too, but there's my axis. And you could label that. You could say tick format equals D, and then return D, and we give it a margin. Now you'll notice it's getting worse and worse with the top one, but what I'm formatting for is actually the bottom, not the top. So let's keep in mind that this is meant to make the sparkline down here look good. And here we go. Now I've got, and it says 45, and it says 45 in a giant number that doesn't even look like it's the axis, right? So let's get rid of the bottom axis, because I think that's getting in the way. And then let's now tick format, like most of the functions that happen in JSX or in SVG or HTML space in Semiotic, can return a string, or it can return, in this case, JSX SVG. So I can send back if I knew how to program JSX anymore. Right? I could send it a much smaller piece of text. You can see that down there, this tiny little piece. So let's say fill equals dark red. Maybe dark red will be more visible. Why is it not? Oh, right, because style overwrites attributes. Style equals object that says fill dark red. If I ever say something and you don't know what I'm talking about, feel free to ask me. I'll be happy to explain it in more detail, especially when it's something like that, which is just sort of generic HTML or DOM or JavaScript or CSS stuff. I'm just going to sort of gloss over it. And you can notice that our 45 is being drawn at the bottom of the axis element. I'd rather it be drawn at the middle. So let's drop this back up, say a couple. There we go. And I'm going to change the font because I don't want to go through the steps of changing the tick line color. I'm going to change the font color just to black so it doesn't. And in fact, 45. points. There we go. Give it a little bit more of a margin, even more of a margin. And margin's eating into the size of the little sparkline. But I think that's fine. And then go in here and actually change the text around it. I know this sounds silly, but really, if you want to think about how you might demo and design something, eventually, when it has to do with the context of where it's being delivered, it helps to have better context than just a sort of generic lorem ipsum. And you'll notice this is that line height thing. See how it's not computing a line height? I have to send it a line height. I want to see something real quick. And this shouldn't happen. This should not be happening. If it is, file a bug. This shouldn't be happening in a normal application. I think this is a CodePen thing. Right, that's not how CSS works. 30 pixels. I want to see what happens if I apply it as a rule in CSS. I didn't think so. I think that's very interesting. So this relies on a DOM computed height property that I have a feeling the way that CodePen is constantly refreshing this, that it's not honoring that. But I'll get into that. And if it's not, if you are, dealing with times when it doesn't seem like it's styling according to your line height, then manually set the line height. Change the text. That's what I was doing. For the first time in 13 years, the Queen's Park Rangers dipped below 45 points for a season. I think they're called seasons. Are they called seasons? Who knows? Who knows how this stuff works? And we're sent down. Demoted, sent down. I don't know how it works. Anyway. And so there's a sparkline with a little axis, right? I don't think that typically you want to use axes, right? Normally you're showing sort of general trends, and it's enough that they see that big dip at that point. But there are times when you might want to add elements to it. Let's pretend, not knowing anything about these guys, that this spike was also the year that they won something. And maybe we would want to annotate that, right? First, I have to find out what that spike is. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to override the margins that I'm sending to my XY frame axes equals. I'm going to override the axes too. I'm going to send it some fresh axes. And fresh margin, just so I can read this chart, so I can design the next thing I want to do. So it looks like in 1987 they had this spike. So let's go find out. Let's go make an annotation. So const winning annotation equals. It's weird that it's not styling anything there. Why is it not styling anything? Who knows? Looks like everything's fine. Type. Okay, so we're making an annotation. An annotation is an object. Annotation has types. I'm going to stick with a default React annotation. I'm going to give it a label of they won something. And I'll put an asterisk on it, just in case somebody sees this later and says, but they didn't win anything that year. This person doesn't know what they're talking about. I mean, you don't want somebody to think that when they come by your CodePen. You lose all credibility. Year, and I'm pausing here because I'm going to just set it to the value at that year. So let's turn on hover annotation. Hover annotation true. Oh, which reminds me of a feature that this has, right? So hover annotation, you've seen this before. I can go and hover on these things and find out what things are. I'd want to style this, the CSS for this hover box a little bit better than this. This obviously looks junky. You can just style that in CSS. 67 wins. They had 67 wins that year. Or 67 points. Points. 67. And I go by points. I have no idea. I assume points are more important than wins. But I don't know. So anyway, we've got this winning annotation. You know, you can go sit here and say annotations equals an array, which includes that winning annotation. You might have other annotations you want. And there it is. It draws that they won something. And because of the way that D3 annotation, React annotation works, it's being drawn right on top of it. So you can't tell what point it refers to that well, because it doesn't draw a connector. You have to offset it for it to draw a connector, so it becomes a little bit more legible. So let's offset that a little bit, and maybe that, just so it'll draw a little arrow, a little line and arrow to when they won something, asterisk, right? There's our annotation. The thing I wanted to get to before I get into adding annotations to things is to notice that when I hover over this chart, if I turn on hover annotations, it does have annotations. And it has a different kind of annotations, and that's because under the hood, none of the Sparkline, none of the Spark frames in Semiotic have an HTML annotation layer. It's not something I thought made sense, and it's not something I wanted to go and put all this technical support in when I don't imagine people are going to be using that. So instead, all of the Spark frames will only handle SVG annotations. And by default, the XY frame, none of the other frames do this, but the XY frame by default, if you turn on hover annotation, will give you a very simple hover annotation that will tell you the value at each position, and only the Y value. It doesn't even tell you the X value. Now you can go in there and you can make it into whatever you want. You can make it any kind of annotation function. Maybe we'll do that. But I just wanted to point out that it does have built-in tooltips. Those tooltips are SVG, and they use React annotation. And it also, just like I passed these annotations over to XY frame, if I wanted to, I could pass that same annotation into the Spark XY frame, wherever it might live. There it is. And there it is, right? You could have, you would probably want to style this text a little bit differently, or maybe you wouldn't, or maybe you only want it to have a color. Let's go see what it looks like in different colors. Sure. But the point is that you can see that you can deliver all the same sort of functionality, all the same elements in Sparkline or Spark ordinal frame, Spark bar chart, Spark network diagram, as you do in the standard diagram. And what I've tried to do in implementing this is simply to give it smarter defaults. There's some different functionality, but for the most part, the functionality is the same. You do lose access to those HTML tooltips because I don't think they make sense. But mostly it's smarter defaults, like the zero margins and the removal of ticks on axes by default. So with that said, I think I want to actually try to see what other kind of data we could make here. So if we take QPR data, that's the Queen's Park Rangers, but that's really anybody who's in this whole data set. Let's go jump into it real quick. Look for, let's stop console logging, all of that. And and see what else we have. As I always like to say when I do this, let's find a team I know. Arsenal. Arsenal is team 18. So const Arsenal data equals Premier lines 18. And what I'm going to do, because this is all formatted for lines for a line chart, but I don't want to use a line chart this time. I want to do other cool things. So I'm going to take the coordinates out of Arsenal, which are the individual years, the performance in individual years. What I want to make sure of is I pull out any years where they just don't have any data, because that happens. So I want to get rid of any object that doesn't have a team quality. So dot coordinates, dot filter, d dot team. Okay. So I just want the data. Oops, I think it's team with capital T, wasn't it? Yeah. All right, let's take a look at the data that looks like. .log Arsenal data. Arsenal data. So I've got 61 points. There's 61 years for which we have data. And it has draws and losses and position and points. So what I think would be cool is to take that Arsenal data and create another, let's say, box plot, or we'll call it summary, because maybe we want to jump between them. Summary frame properties. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an ordinal frame to look at the Arsenal data. Arsenal data. Take all the same properties to begin with. And we'll just instantiate one of these so we see something happening and changing while I'm doing this, so that it's a more interesting experience. Ordinal frame. And then I want Arsenal frame properties. Get rid of all that stuff. Who knows what's going on? Let's see. Arsenal frame properties. Summary frame properties. I didn't call it Arsenal frame. That would make too much sense. Summary frame properties. And then, oh, it's inside the same div. Is it? It is. So get it out of that div, put it in its own div, let it float around. All right. So there it is as a bar chart. You can see that it's covering up because it's drawing some background and it's covering up my annotations now, which is annoying. So where should I put my annotations? Put them underneath. Who knows? Why am I interrupting myself to go and move something that doesn't have anything to do with what we were already dealing with? I don't know. This is what happens when you live code. This is what always happens. Try it again. They won something. Looks terrible. Maybe if I just keep adjusting it forever, it will continue to look worse. Anyway, I'm not gonna waste my time. It can look terrible for now, and I can come back to it. So I've got this data set here. It's a bar chart. I don't want a bar chart. What I wanted actually was a summary chart of some sort. Maybe that's what summary is short for. Maybe that's what's, no, I'm sorry, that's a terrible joke. In the wrong one. Let's see, summary frame properties. Okay, type. Summary type. And we can say, what's a violin look like? And I don't want points, I actually want position. think it's POS, because I want to know like what's the position that they're in. And the O accessor is not years. The O accessor is just nothing. And I'm literally putting a nothing in there, so it puts all of the O in the same one, right? I'm trying to put all of the values into a single column. So I want just a single column chart here. So it doesn't matter what I put into my O accessor. I could put null or really anything. Just anything. Well, null isn't that weird that null comes back? That's unexpected. But I can put anything else, and it should just drop them all in the same. Or maybe 0 comes back as testing that there's nothing there. This is really interesting. All right, I'm not going to get caught up in this either. If I just give it a value that does not exist in the data set, it'll dump everything into a single column. So I want it to be horizontal, actually. Horizontal. And so it's giving me this number of finishes by position. And what I actually want to do with the summary type here is go into type, give it a more complex type, reduce the number of bins. It's giving it so many bins that it's not really showing just these sort of pulses. And that's more of a violin chart. And that's exactly what I want, right? So I can see that for the most part, Arsenal seems to be finishing in 1st through 5th place. They seem to be doing a pretty good job. And summary style. Summary style, fill tan. Okay, there it goes. Just took a while. And do I want an axis? Sure, why not? I don't really care. You'll notice it says right, but because I've turned it horizontal, it defaults to bottom. And now I can take this and, as I've done with everything else, let's go write some kind of story about them. Arsenal seems to do well. And then I'm going to get rid of this Spark frame. Don't need the annotations here. Arsenal summary frame properties. Let's see what happens. Nothing happens. What's going on here? Oh, it's because it's an XY frame. Remember, you have to use the right frame. I can't guess for you, even though it should. So there we go. Arsenal seems to do well. 100 pixels seems like a little much for that. It seems pretty stretched out. We'll make it 50 and see what it looks like. And we make it 50. We can, you could imagine how this little glyph could then work out pretty well, right? You could say, Arsenal seems to do well. Let's see. Let me adjust it further. I want it actually a little bit smaller than that. I want to reduce the bins. There's a lot going on here now. That's what happens when you try to do these examples. I'm going to reduce the bins a bit to make that violin plot a little bit less granular. There we go. And then we can say Arsenal does well. And I think you see where I'm going with this, which is to say, in contrast to Everton. Everybody knows Everton is the worst team in the English Premier League. I mean, we could compare them to the Queen's Park Rangers, but who knows? Who knows how they do? So this is currently not Everton, obviously. But if we go in here and we say, remember, the only thing going on here is that Arsenal data is going into that summary frame properties. So we can go and we could get Queen's Park data, just differentiate it from this other one, and then Everton I always say Queen's Park because I know what the number is. It's literally right here. You could have a better system for putting this together. Obviously, if you were going to put this into production, you would probably want a better system than this. But let's go look and see where poor Everton sits. Everton, team number 7. For a team so old, you'd think they would have done better. All right? All right. So, in contrast to Everton and Queen's Park Rangers. And what am I going to do? I'm going to take these Spark ordinal frames, these little violin plots, which is all they are, little violin plots. Drop it there, and then I'm going to, just like I'm overriding the size, I'll just override the data. I'll override the data here with the Everton data. I think it's called Everton data, isn't that right? Yeah. And then we'll override this one with Queen's Park data. Capital D, I think. Maybe even capital P. Right. And now we have these little charts. And I think what we want to do is pull the axes out because I'm sick of the axes. Bar axis. Bar summary axis. There we go. And so this is the whole point of a sort of sparkline or spark chart thing. Now you'll notice that it looks like Everton actually doesn't do so bad and Queen's Park doesn't do so bad, but that's because we are literally filtering out the times when they didn't show up. So what happens when we get rid of those? Then what does it look like? So Arsenal doesn't, the shape of Arsenal doesn't change that much, even though you've got a lot more zeros now. But boy, the shape of Queen's Park changes a lot. Oh, isn't that funny? The 0 is unfortunately going to make people look better than they really are because the 0, position 0, is showing up at the front because of that R accessor. So, summary frame properties. What do I mean by that? Well, here's the thing. Our R accessor is treating the position as a numerical value. But position 0 actually means that you are not even in the league. So it's actually worse than anything else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the R accessor with an actual function. That function is going to return if dpos does not equal 0, then it'll return d.pos. Otherwise, it'll return, let's say 20. I don't know how many teams there are in the league, but that should be somewhere far in the back. And there we go. Now Queen's Park does not look like the powerhouse that they did because most of the time they weren't even in this league. And now you have a little summary chart in the same way that you could have little summary charts, right? In the same way, what's the typical summary chart that we see Sparklines used for? That typical summary chart, I'm going to write it because I think that's really the whole point of these things, right? The typical summary sparkline that you see out in the wild is with stock prices like Apple. I think it's Apple with 2 A's, right? And then P and Apple. I'm going to just cheat here and give you the unannotated make it a little bit smaller. Once again, darn this code pen, it's not honoring my line height. So I've got to manually fix the line height. But otherwise, there we go. Wow, that's terrible. Probably because it's got some kind of margin or something in it, right? Yeah, right, the 45 points. Okay. Come on. Oh, because it's not going to overwrite. Let's see. All right. We'll do it the other way around. Line frame properties. Line frame properties. Pull the axis out of here. Pull the margin out of here. Drop those specifically into our little Everton XY frame. This has gotten to be quite a mess, hasn't it? It's all right. That's all right. That just means that we're doing a good job in writing a lot of code when it gets to be that much of a mess. I think what I want is there, and then margin equals there. Let's see what that looks like. There we go. Perfect. So this is your typical Sparkline, right? You see like Apple stock price, and then in parentheses it shows you its recent upward or downward trend. You could make something that was more annotated, that was annotated inline. Now that I've changed my line order and all of that stuff, I can adjust my little line annotation so that it looks nicer again. I'm going to add to the text. Typical Sparkline. Right, we could annotate it. We could make it interactive. That's easy enough, and you could adjust this so that it tells you a little bit more for your users. I tried to make it as minimal as possible because these are very minimal charts, and so I could imagine, you know, there's enough actually going on semantically with this chart for you to know that this is a stock price by day or something like that. But you could, you know, change this annotation so it literally says the date or it says something else about it. You could add axes, you could add annotations to your Sparklines. And more importantly, you don't have to use lines, right? The whole idea here is use recognizable shapes that are good summary objects within text that provide interesting context. And in this case, we've got this really nice violin plot that shows that Arsenal has spent most of the time on the top of the league, that Everton has spent in a sort of a barbell pattern. They've spent quite a bit of the time up at the top, but they've also spent quite a bit of the time at the bottom. And the Queen's Park Rangers barely ever show up in Premier League. And that's reflected by the shape of this chart. And if you wanted to, you know, you could go and, in sort of true semiotic style, you could go talk to your audience. And you could say, well, we could look at it this way. Or we could look at it in different ways, right? We could look at these as a box plot. Maybe a box plot makes more sense to your audience. In that case, you have to kind of give it a stroke. Right. And so that box plot tells the same story, but it tells it in a different sort of way. You wanted to maybe a heat map, which again tells the same story in a different way. A little bit less. Heat maps are hard when most of the areas of the heat map are almost transparent. And let's see, contour plots are probably almost impossible. Like, these are not things that people are accustomed to. So joy plot in this case is not going to be much of a joy plot. It's just going to look like a sort of inline filled line chart, which might work for people. It's just half of a violin plot in this case. I think I like the box plot the most. And I think in a box plot, in that case, those lines are terrible. We'll just give it tan lines, and then we'll give it tan lines. We'll lighten the fill by using a fill opacity. And that's fine for now. And in doing this, you sort of embed in your text interesting summary information that is that's readable, that's not getting in the way. Those could be they could be as simple and as well known as sort of lines for putting line charts in. They could be annotated lines or lines with a little bit more decoration. They could be summary items like box plots. They could be bar charts. We didn't get into networks, but networks are pretty straightforward. I mean, everything's straightforward because literally all you're doing is dropping the frame in using the same settings that you would use anywhere else, and then but instead just using the Spark version of it. So let me just do that really quickly because that's how easy it is. Not Spark network frame. I'm going to do this one quick and ugly. Edges. Edges is an array of source and target, right? And that's literally all an edge list is. And so I can sit here and say source and target, source and target, source and target, source and target. And I can adjust these so that A is connected to a bunch of things and B is connected to fewer things and different things. And I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of network data, but that's all networks are. And the only issue is network frame. There's my data. And I know I'm doing it all inline, so it looks super ugly. But we also want to style the edges so that they have a stroke of, say, gray, light gray. Gray is a really dark gray, I've got to say. It's not as medium a gray as I would expect. Maybe make the stroke width slightly larger. 2. Maybe that's too thick. We'll see. See what it looks like. There we go. And you can see that there's a little network down here with the little strokes. And it's literally the network that's described in this array of edges. And I think this actually could be super powerful. Like you could go and talk about patterns in networks in text and actually use the structures within the networks, which actually are relatively readable and relatively recognizable for folks. You'll notice I didn't set any kind of size, and so as a result, it's a square. It's based off of your line height, and that's it. That's all the text there was to making a network. Making a network takes very little effort, right? It also, I mean, unfortunately, making a network takes very little effort. As a result, you see lots of people making networks that are rather terrible because it's easy to make networks out of things. So that's it. That's what I wanted to cover with these Sparkline style charts, these inline text charts. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions about it, as usual, just ping me on Twitter or leave a feature request or a bug report or any other kind of issue on GitHub. Email me, but just reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about this. I'm happy to explain in more detail how to get things to work. I hope you found it useful. I hope you use Sparklines all over. I think they're extremely powerful, and I've tried to make them as easy as possible to drop into whatever kind of work you're doing. That's it, and have a good weekend.